Yeah. Om Tavakathamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibiriritam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Srimadatam Bhuviranantiye Bhurida Janaha. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our monthly gospel class. Last time we talked about the entry from March 11th, 1882, and we're going to discuss the next entry, but there are some issues, some textual issues, which I want to mention first, and there's a lot to cover today. Okay, so in Nikhilanji's translation, The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, the entry following March 11th, 1882 is dated April 2nd, 1882, and it's Sri Ramakrishna's visit to his disciple Keshab Chandra Sen. Okay? And then the next entry in Nikhilanji's version, translation, is April 9th, 1882, 1 week later. And it's Sri Ramakrishna's visit to Pran Krishna Mukherjee. Okay, that might be okay if it weren't for the fact that if you look at the original Bengali, Sri Ramakrishna's visit to Pran Krishna Mukherjee was actually April 2nd, not April 9th. And it preceded his visit to Keshab. And it's very strange because Nikhilanji even writes in the April 9th entry, which we're going to start with, even though it's not April 9th, it's April 2nd. So basically, I'll just give you the gist of it. In the first paragraph, it's announced that Sri Ramakrishna is visiting Pran Krishna Mukherjee. And then he plans to visit Captain. That's the name of this, another one of his householder devotees. And after visiting Captain, he's going to visit Keshab Sen the same day in the afternoon. So even though it clearly says that he's going to visit Keshab later in the day, on the same day, Nikhilanji puts it 1 week earlier, on April 2nd. Yeah. So anyway, so the thing is, I think that it's possible that Nikhilanji in the 1930s when he was doing this translation, that he was relying on a defective Bengali translation, Bengali original Gautamrita, which may have had some dates misplaced or something like that, because this is such a big discrepancy. So in any case, the truth is, according to the original Bengali, that the entry following March 11th, 1882 is April 2nd, 1882, and it's Sri Ramakrishna's visit to Pran Krishna Mukherjee. And the next entry is his visit to Keshab Sen. So we're going to follow that order, okay? So I'm going to skip the Keshab Sen section in the Gospel, and we're going to go straight to the one dated April 9th, 1882, but that's wrongly dated. It should be April 2nd, 1882. All right, so with all that as prelude, let's begin. Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Ramakrishna was seated with his devotees in the drawing room of Pran Krishna Mukherjee's house in Kolkata. It was between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Since Colonel Bishwanath lived in that neighborhood, the master intended to visit him before going to see Keshab at the Lily Cottage. A number of neighbors and other friends of Pran Krishna had been invited to meet Sri Ramakrishna. They were all eager to hear his words. Okay, so the first thing which I already mentioned is that it's stated here that after visiting Pran Krishna Mukherjee, he's going to visit Captain and then visit Keshab. And again, that's what makes it so strange that Nikhilanji puts the Keshab visit 1 week earlier than this. The other thing to note is an entire line is omitted. One thing that's really wonderful about the Gospel in the original Bengali is that M was so meticulous in the details. And he was a wonderful eyewitness observer of what was happening. And so he actually mentioned every single person or many of the people who were in the room. And in this case, there's a line which is omitted from the English, which is, he mentions all the different people. He says, Ram, Monomohan, Kedar, Shurendro, Girindro, Shurendrer Bhrata, Rakhal, Bolaram, Master Prabhuti, Bhaktara Upasthit. He gives this long list of 7 or 8 people who are present there, and that whole sentence is omitted by Nikhilanji. But these details, I think, are important because it helps to set the scene and just for historical purposes as well. Okay, so now let's continue. Now we get to the first big, meaty conversation. Sri Ramakrishna, God and His glory. This universe is God's glory. People see His glory and forget everything. They do not seek God, whose glory is this world. All seek to enjoy Kamini Ganjan. But there is too much misery and worry in that. This world is like the whirlpool of the Vishalakshi. Once a boat gets into it, there is no hope of its rescue. What is Vishalakshi? There's a footnote. A stream near Sri Ramakrishna's birthplace. Kind of like a whirlpool almost. Once a boat gets into it, there's no hope of its rescue. Again, the world is like a thorny bush. You have hardly freed yourself from one set of thorns before you find yourself entangled in another. Once you enter a labyrinth, you find it very difficult to get out. Living in the world, a man becomes seared, as it were, a devotee. Then what is the way, sir? Sri Ramakrishna. Prayer and the company of holy men. You cannot get rid of an ailment without the help of a physician. But it is not enough to be in the company of religious people only for a day. You should constantly seek it, for the disease has become chronic. Again, you cannot understand the pulse rightly unless you live with the physician. Moving with him constantly, you learn to distinguish between the pulse of phlegm and the pulse of bile. Devotee. What is the good of holy company? Sri Ramakrishna. It begets yearning for God. It begets love of God. Nothing whatsoever is achieved in spiritual life without yearning. By constantly living in the company of holy men, the soul becomes restless for God. This yearning is like the state of mind of a man who has someone ill in the family. His mind is in a state of perpetual restlessness, thinking how the sick person may be cured. Or again, one should feel a yearning for God like the yearning of a man who has lost his job and is wandering from one office to another in search of work. If he is rejected at a certain place which has no vacancy, he goes there again the next day and inquires, is there any vacancy today? There is another way, earnestly praying to God. God is our very own. We should say to him, O God, what is thy nature? Reveal thyself to me. Thou must show thyself to me. For why else hast thou created me? Some Sikh devotees once said to me, God is full of compassion. I said, but why should we call him compassionate? He is our creator. What is there to be wondered at if he is kind to us? Parents bring up their children. Do you call that an act of kindness? They must act that way. Therefore, we should force our demands on God. He is our father and mother, isn't he? If the son demands his patrimony and gives up food and drink in order to enforce his demand, then the parents hand his share over to him 3 years before the legal time. Or when the child demands some pice from his mother and says over and over again, Mother, give me a couple of pice, I beg you on my knees. Then the mother, seeing his earnestness and unable to bear it anymore, tosses the money to him. There is another benefit from holy company. It helps one cultivate discrimination between the real and the unreal. God alone is the real, that is to say, the eternal substance, and the world is unreal, that is to say, transitory. As soon as a man finds his mind wandering away to the unreal, he should apply discrimination. The moment an elephant stretches out its trunk to eat a plantain tree in a neighbor's garden, it gets a blow from the iron goad of the driver. So let's pause here. There's a lot here to discuss. First of all, with regard to that first paragraph of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, where he talks about God and God's glory. One thing in general I find, I've talked about this before, but I'll mention it again. We keep hearing he and his to refer to God, but I really think it's far more accurate to refer to God as she, because Sri Ramakrishna would think of God as Divine Mother, as his beloved Kali. And there are little details, which I'll come to later, where he really emphasizes mother a little later in what I read. But with regard to worldliness, right, in that first paragraph, he says, people see God's glory and forget everything. They do not seek God, whose glory is this world. All seek to enjoy lust and greed, kamani kanchan. But there's too much misery and worry in that. That's Nikhilanji's translation of the Bengali, which is Kintu dukkhu ashanti beshi. And I feel like that's not quite accurate as a translation. Kintu dukkhu ashanti beshi in Bangla means, as far as I can tell, no matter how much joy you get out of worldly pleasures, you will end up getting more distress, more suffering, and lack of peace of mind in the end. So if you compare in a balance between the amount of happiness you get from the worldly pleasure and the amount of pain you get from it, the pain outweighs the happiness. That seems to be the stress here in the Bengali. And when Nikhilanji says, but there's too much misery and worry in that, I don't think it quite conveys that. I mean, if you look at the Bangla, I think it resonates well with things like, he says, for instance, in other places in the Gospel, he says that there's a farmer who has a giant storehouse full of invaluable grain, and he needs to protect it from the rats. How does he do that? He throws some puffed rice in a corner somewhere outside of that storehouse, and the rats will chase after that puffed rice, which is extremely cheap and not as tasty. And so the rats will eat that and ignore the giant storehouse of invaluable grain. So likewise, worldly people are chasing after these pleasures which are ultimately empty and which give very little happiness in the end, and ignoring the infinite mine of bliss that is God. And I think that this original Bangla, Kintu dukkhu ashanti beshi, that all worldly pleasures end up giving us greater pain and suffering in the end. You find that in the Gita, in the Bhagavad Gita, in several places. So for instance, chapter 5, verse 22, Ye hi samspashya bhoga dukkha yonya evate adyantavanta kaunteya nateshu ramate buddha. Those, all sense enjoyments are ultimately sources of suffering, dukkha yonya. And then it explains why. Krishna says, Adi antavanta kaunteya, because all of these worldly pleasures have an adi, a beginning, and an anta, an end. They're transitory. Nateshu ramate buddha. So the wise people, they don't relish these things. Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to point to. Another thing is, right after the devotee asks this question, then what is the way, sir? After Sri Ramakrishna paints this pretty bleak picture of worldly life, he says, what is the way, sir? Because they're stuck in the world. Okay. Immediately after that, in the original Bengali, there's a new section heading, which is not present in the English translation. The section heading is Upai, Sadhushango ar Prarthana. Upai means upaya in Sanskrit, which means the way, the means. And then M writes, there are two main ways, which he's anticipating Sri Ramakrishna's answer. The two ways are Sadhushango, which means holy company, the company of sadhus in a broad sense, and Prarthana, which means prayer. Okay, so that's just to flag that it's a new section. And then Sri Ramakrishna explains that these two things, first prayer and then the company of holy men. But in the context of the next question, the devotee asks, what is the good of holy company? And then Nikhilanji says the following. Sri Ramakrishna, in his translation, says, it begets yearning for God. It begets love of God. Nothing whatsoever is achieved in spiritual life without yearning. And one thing I think is significant is that if we look at the original Bengali here, I'll just read it. Bhakto, sadhu sange ki upakar hoy? What benefit is there from sadhu sangha? Sri Ramakrishna, Ishore anurag hoy. It's an unusual term, actually. Anurag. Anuraga is a Sanskrit term here. That's the term anuraga, which Niklanji translates as yearning. Okay, next sentence. Tar upor bhalobasha hoy. That's what Niklanji translates as it begets love of God. And their bhalobasha, I think that's quite accurate. Bhalobasha means love of God. Love. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, Vyakulata na ele kichui hoy na. Vyakulata is the term used for yearning in the third sentence. Nothing whatsoever is achieved in spiritual life without yearning. That yearning there is not anuraga, it's vyakulata. But the same English term yearning is being used to translate the first term anuraga and the second term vyakulata. And I think that's striking. I mean, one question is, why does Sri Ramakrishna use the term anuraga in the first sentence and switch to yearning in the third sentence? Niklanji seemed to have thought that they were just synonyms, right? And so he used the same term to explain both. One suggestion I have is that maybe that anuraga matures into vyakulata. That vyakulata is a further developed stage of longing for God, and that anuraga is an earlier stage in the same process. Otherwise, why does he use different terms? That's just that it could be that they are strictly synonymous, but I think it's significant that he uses two different words here. And then for the rest of the passage, he keeps using the word vyakulata. Okay? So that again gets missed in the translation. The other thing I just wanted to point out is the two examples he gives of true longing for God are both very worldly examples, right? A guy who's out of work and is looking for, going from office to office, asking for work, and the other one is a householder who's sitting at home and he's worried about a family member who's very ill, and his mind is constantly drifting toward that ill family member, right? So again, it's a nice touch that Sri Ramakrishna, as a way of showing sympathy for his householder disciples, is actually using worldly examples that he thinks will resonate with them, to explain a very high spiritual state, right? Intense longing for God. Okay, then in the next paragraph, Sri Ramakrishna talks about this Sikh devotee saying God is full of compassion, and he challenges them and says, and it's very interesting because when we think about our parents and how much they did for us, it would sound odd to say that our parents are so compassionate toward us, right? So I think that's the intuition that he's tapping into here, is that if you're their very own, then see, compassion implies some kind of distance between the person showing the compassion and the person receiving the compassion, right? But between family members, there's no distance, or there shouldn't be, right? So in the same way, God is our very own. That's the main message that he wants. Not that God is not compassionate, but that he's much more. God is your very, very, very own mother, your very own father. That's the idea. And little subtle things I wanted to point out just textually. In the original Bengali, you find mother coming before father, for instance, when he says, Ma bap cheleke palon korbe, she abar doya ki. Ma bap. Ma means mother. Ma in almost every language is mother. And bap means father. But mother comes first. But here, it's reversed. Well, no, not reversed. It's saying, he just writes parents. Parents bring up their children. But it's actually ma bap. Of course, it means the same thing, but again, with the precedence to mother here. And then 2 sentences later, Sri Ramakrishna says, Tini je apnar ma, apnar bap, which Niklanji renders as, he is our father and mother, isn't he? And here, again, notice that in the original Bengali, apnar ma comes first, then comes bap. So I think it would be more accurate to say, she is our mother and father, isn't she? That would be my correction. Okay, and then we get to this very controversial last paragraph of what I just read about Sat. Okay, let me read the Bengali first, Sat and Asat, about discrimination between what Niklanji calls the real and the unreal. Sadhu Sangha korle ar ekti upakar hoy, shot ashot bichar. Shot, nitya padatha arthat ishwar, ashot arthat anitya. অসৎ পথে মন গেলেই বিচার করতে হয় হাতি পরের কলা গাছ খেতে সুর বাড়ালে সেই সময় মাহুত ডাঙোস মারে. All right. So, Nikanji says, another benefit of holy company is that it helps one cultivate discrimination between, and he says, the real with the capital R and the unreal. The original Bengali is discrimination between sat and asat. And then everything depends on how you interpret these terms sat and asat. Fortunately, Sri Ramakrishna immediately goes on to define both the terms in the next sentence. So Sri Ramakrishna says, Shot, nitya padartha arthat ishwar. Sat means the eternal reality, arthat ishwar, that is, or in other words, God. That's what he's saying. And here, God alone is the real, that is to say, the eternal substance. I think that's okay, more or less. But then it gets, I think, tricky. Because then Niklanji goes on to say, and the world is unreal, that is to say, transitory. And here, Sri Ramakrishna says, asat, ashot, arthat anitya. He's defining asat as anitya, which means impermanent, transitory. But he doesn't say unreal here. You see, he's defining sat as the eternal God, and he's defining asat as the impermanent, but not necessarily unreal. And Nikanji, I think possibly because of his leanings toward classical Advaita Vedanta, is bringing in the unreality of the world concept that is not actually present in the original. So if one doesn't know Bengali and one relies on this translation, one might easily be led to assume, especially cumulatively, because it's not just here but in many places that Niklanji adds these terms like unreal, where you might think that Sri Ramakrishna is towing a Shankaran line here, which I don't think he is. Okay, so that's another thing I wanted to bring your attention to. And now, let's get to the final section of this, of today's reading at least. It's very interesting. A neighbor. Why does a man have sinful tendencies? Sri Ramakrishna. In God's creation, there are all sorts of things. He has created bad men as well as good men. It is He who gives us good tendencies, and it is He again who gives us evil tendencies. Neighbor. In that case, we aren't responsible for our sinful actions, are we? It's a very interesting question. Master. Sin begets its own result. This is God's law. Won't you burn your tongue if you chew a chili? In his youth, Mothur led a rather fast life, so he suffered from various diseases before his death. One may not realize this in youth. I have looked into the hearth in the kitchen of the Kali temple when logs are being burnt. At first, the wet wood burns rather well. It doesn't seem then that it contains much moisture. But when the wood is sufficiently burnt, all the moisture runs back to one end. At last, water squirts from the fuel and puts out the fire. So one should be careful about anger, passion, and greed. Take, for instance, the case of Hanuman. In a fit of anger, he burnt Ceylon. At last, he remembered that Sita was living in the Ashoka grove. Then he began to tremble, lest the fire should injure her. Neighbor. Why has God created wicked people? Sri Ramakrishna. That is his will. I'm going to just say her from now. So that is her will, her play. In her Maya, there exists avidya as well as vidya. Darkness is needed too. It reveals all the more the glory of light. There is no doubt that anger, lust, and greed are evils. Why then has God created them? In order to create saints. A man becomes a saint by conquering the senses. Is there anything impossible for a man who has subdued his passions? He can even realize God through her grace. Again, see how her whole play of creation is perpetuated through lust. Wicked people are needed too. At one time, the tenants of an estate became unruly. The landlord had to send Golok Chaudhuri, who was a ruffian. He was such a harsh administrator that the tenants trembled at the very mention of his name. There is need of everything. Once Sita said to her husband, Rama, it would be grand if every house in Ayodhya were a mansion. I find many houses old and dilapidated, "But my dear," said Rama, "if all the houses were beautiful ones, what would the masons do?" Laughter. God has created all kinds of things. He has created good trees and poisonous plants and weeds as well. Among the animals, there are good, bad, and all kinds of creatures: tigers, lions, snakes, and so on. So I'll pause here because, again, there's a lot to discuss here. So, big question: why does a person have sinful tendencies? Here, the question is, Pratibeshi, Mahashoy, Pap Buddhi keno hoy? Papa Buddhi. Okay, sinful tendencies, that's okay. Papa Buddhi, or, yeah, a sinfully inclined mind. And now here, I want to point out, let me read you Sri Ramakrishna's answer in the original. Sri Ramakrishna, "Taar jogote shokol rokom ache. Sadhu lokও তিনি করেছেন, দুষ্ট লোকও তিনি করেছেন। সৎ বুদ্ধি তিনিই দেন, অসৎ বুদ্ধিও তিনিই দেন." This is interesting. Even people who don't know Bengali will probably have caught that. At the end of this, in Bengali, Sri Ramakrishna is saying, she, God alone, gives us, human beings, sat buddhi, S-A-T, and to other people, asat buddhi. Does this remind us of something? The same sat and asat, which was used just one or two paragraphs before, about discrimination between sat and asat. You see, and that gets lost in the translation because here Nikanji translates sat buddhi as good tendencies and asat buddhi as evil tendencies, but you're going to miss the connection with real and unreal in the previous paragraph. The same terms are used, which I think is very significant, because that also explains why the neighbor is suddenly asking about sinful tendencies. And Sri Ramakrishna's answer is very consistent. Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to point to. The other thing is, the answer is kind of startling, or it should be startling, I think, or at least for people who didn't attend my Sunday talk on Sunday. Do we have free will? Because Sri Ramakrishna says that it's God who gives us evil tendencies as well as good tendencies. And then immediately the question is, well then, if God, that gets us off the hook. God made us evil, then it's not our responsibility for doing evil things, right? It's God's responsibility. This is the next question. In that case, we aren't responsible for our sinful actions, are we? Now, I think it gets really interesting. First of all, there's another new section heading in the original Bengali. Okay, the section heading is Papi Daitto o Karmafal. Okay, the section is called Papi Daitto, which means the responsibility of the sinner, o Karmafal, and the fruits of karma. Okay? But this first part of this section heading is very interesting. Papi Daitto. M, who made these section headings, Papi Daitto, I think that what he's implying in the section heading is that Sri Ramakrishna, in his answer to this neighbor's question, says, yes, you are responsible for your actions, even though God gives us evil tendencies. It seems to be moving in that direction, the section heading. If that's the case, I think that's a little misleading. I think that Sri Ramakrishna's position is more complicated and nuanced than that. I think Sri Ramakrishna is actually saying, in a way, when the neighbor asks, in that case, we aren't responsible for our sinful actions, are we? I think his answer is, yeah, you're right, in one sense. And at the same time, there are a couple things going on, okay? So long, remember, those of you who have watched my talk on Sunday, but I'm just going to recap for people who aren't familiar with Sri Ramakrishna's views on free will, which he talks about in other places in the Gospel. What he says is, only those who have realized God really know that God alone is the doer, and that therefore nobody is morally responsible for their actions. But so long as you have not realized God, you must believe that you are free and therefore morally responsible for your actions. Why must you believe? Because God has hardwired us that way in order to prevent sin from increasing. These are just direct statements from Sri Ramakrishna's teachings elsewhere in the Gospel. Okay, so I think we need to keep this all in the background to understand, to appreciate Sri Ramakrishna's response to this question. In that case, we aren't responsible for our sinful actions, are we? So I think Sri Ramakrishna is saying, yeah, in a sense, you're right. We're not. None of us are responsible. But at the same time, there is a thing called the law of karma. Okay, which he then explains as follows: sin begets its own result. This is God's law. Won't you burn your tongue if you chew a chili? Which means that in spite of the fact that God alone is a doer, God has created this law of karma according to which we reap what we sow. So even if we don't ultimately have moral responsibility for our actions, we're still going to suffer if we do evil things. This is just the fact of the world because of the law of karma. Do you see what I mean? I think that's how Sri Ramakrishna is actually answering the question. Not that you're wrong, you are morally responsible for your actions, and the law of karma proves it. I don't think it's quite that. Okay? Another reason why I think this free will stuff is important is because when he says in Bengali, Shat-buddhi tini den, Ashat-buddhiyo tini den, that it's Mother, Divine Mother, who gives us both Sat-buddhi and Asat-buddhi, I think he's thinking of one of his favorite songs of Ram Prasad, the Ami Jontro Tumi Jontri, because Kare dao ma Brahmo podo, Kare dao ma odogami. Huh? Kare? Kare koroma odogami. Yeah. So Ram Prasad is addressing Divine Mother, and he says, to some you give the highest realization of Brahman, the supreme truth. And to others, you bring their minds downward, and you give them evil tendencies. So I think that Sri Ramakrishna is thinking of possibly even this song. There's also an Upanishad, a lesser-known Upanishad, which says the same thing, which both Shankara and Ramanuja quote. I was trying to look up, because I remember reading it in their commentaries, but then I couldn't find it. Do you know? There's a mantra in one of the Upanishads which says basically the same thing, that God raises some people and degrades other people. Devi Suktam. But it's in one of the Upanishads, which Shankara quotes, and it's quite interesting. But it's not one of the canonical ones, as far as I remember. Anyone online, if you can find it, let me know in the YouTube comments. Okay. All right. Now, then comes this another can of worms with the next question asked by the neighbor. Why has God created wicked people? Okay. Tobe Ishwar dushto lok korlen keno? Somebody, I think it was you that asked, what is the word for wicked a long time ago? Here, the word for wicked is dushto, which I think wicked is kind of too strong and too Christian. I think bad people or naughty, because often parents will call their naughty kids, like I was a very naughty kid. They would call me dushto. Bad tendency or bad effect. Yeah. Dushto in Bengali means really doing something mischievous and bad. Bad. Naughty is a very... No, I know. Naughty is more like, but wicked is a bit strong, don't you think, Vada? Wicked, huh? You really feel, okay, all right.
Means he knows what is good, bad,
still
he will do.
Right.
Bad to create problem to others, to make trouble to others, or getting pleasure in that, something. Tendency is bad. Wicked tendency, wicked behavior. Yeah, okay. All right. So Maharaj here is suggesting that dushto, wicked, is actually a reasonable translation. Anyway, so then Sri Ramakrishna says in response, where is it? Oh yeah, here. Sri Ramakrishna says, Tar ichcha, tar lila, tar mayate biddhao ache, abiddhao ache. অন্ধকারেরও প্রয়োজন আছে, অন্ধকার থাকলে আলোর আরও মহিমা প্রকাশ হয়। কাম, ক্রোধ, লোভ খারাপ জিনিস বটে, তবে তিনি দিয়েছেন কেন? মহৎ লোক তৈয়ের করবেন বলে, ইন্দ্রিয় জয় করলে মহৎ হয়, জিতেন্দ্রিয় কি না করতে পারে। Okay, so why has God created wicked people? That is her will, her play. In her Maya, there exists avidya as well as vidya. And so Nikalanji doesn't translate the terms, but they mean, avidya means ignorance and vidya means knowledge. So two kinds of Maya. One is the Maya of ignorance, the other is the Maya of knowledge.
Darkness is needed too. There's no doubt that anger, lust, and greed are evils. Why then has God created them? And I think this is really important. In order to create saints, Mahat lok toyer korben bole. And again, this is should be surprising to us. It's not like an obvious response to this question. Why has God created all these evil tendencies, sinful tendencies like lust and greed and anger? In order to create saints. What's the logic here? He helps us with the next couple sentences. A person becomes a saint by conquering the senses. Is there anything impossible for a person who has subdued his or her passions? You see, so I think the idea is, and there's a lot to unpack here philosophically, but just as a first approximation, I think what he's saying is, unless we are confronted with evil, we won't know what the good is, because you only know what's good by contrast with evil. In yourself and in others. So you see other people doing evil things and you say, ooh, I should avoid doing that. But even when you recognize evil in yourself and you recognize ultimately the consequences, the bad consequences of it, then you're going to try to avoid doing evil in the future. And what happens as a result? Moral growth, moral evolution, spiritual growth and spiritual evolution. So unless you encounter good and evil, both in the world and in yourselves, you're not going to make appreciable moral and spiritual progress. I think that's the overall idea here. But in more detail, I think that I have 2 chapters on this in my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. They're devoted to the problem of evil and Sri Ramakrishna's answer to the problem of evil. And I call his response to the problem of evil his saint-making theodicy. And I call it that based on this sentence, in order to create saints. Theodicy means, this is a fancy term used by philosophers and theologians. Theodicy is comprised of 2 words, theos, which means God, and dice means, D-I-C-E, means justice. So it's like you're putting God on trial, and you're like his defendant, and so you're justifying God. Against this problem of evil, this charge that, what's the charge? What is the problem of evil? The problem of evil is this. God is supposed to be, by definition, perfectly loving, and God is omnipotent. If God is omnipotent and perfectly loving, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? If he loves us, then he would want to prevent us from suffering. If he's omnipotent, then he could prevent us from suffering. There's nothing stopping him from preventing us from suffering. So if he's both omnipotent and perfectly loving, then there should be either no evil in the world, we should all be hunky-dory all the time, living as if we're in heaven, or there should be much less evil and suffering than there actually is. But in either case, God's in trouble. And so theodicy is an attempt to defend God against the charge that he is guilty of this, of cruelty or whatever it is, lack of compassion. And I call Sri Ramakrishna's theodicy a saint-making theodicy because I think this statement, in order to create saints, is at the heart of his theodicy, at the heart of his defense of God. So what is a saint-making theodicy? I think it has 3 main doctrines. The first one is the law of karma, which he already explained. If you eat a chili, your tongue will burn. This is the law of karma. We reap what we sow. At the same time, there are 2 different ways of thinking about the law of karma. One way is the way that most people think about the law of karma. And it's even been kind of taken into English in this sense. You're punished for bad things that you do. So it's called the retributive law of karma. Karma as retribution. I do something bad, therefore I get punished for it eventually in this cosmic way. There's a different way of thinking about the law of karma, which I think is truer to Sri Ramakrishna's understanding of the law of karma. I would call it the evolutionary law of karma. And the idea here is, we reap what we sow, but the purpose of reaping what we sow is to learn from our mistakes and to grow and evolve morally and spiritually. That's the idea. So the overarching aim of the law of karma is not punishment. It's not retribution, but moral and spiritual growth. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Okay, so the law of karma, but understood in the evolutionary sense, not in the retributive sense. Not as punishment, but as a law that fosters our moral and spiritual growth. Second, the law of karma is intimately intertwined with the doctrine of rebirth.
the moment you say we reap what we sow, then you also have to posit lives before this and after this. Why? Because we don't just reap what we sow in this life. So we do many things in this life, both good and bad. We don't necessarily reap the fruits of what we do in this life. We might, but we may not. Often we reap what we sow in the next life, actually. We sow in this life and we reap in the next life, either good or bad. Okay? So the doctrine of karma and the doctrine of rebirth kind of mutually entail each other. Yeah, do you have a question? Oh, okay. And then there's a third doctrine, a third key doctrine in the saint-making theodicy, which I think is also extremely important. It's the doctrine of universal liberation. Every single soul will eventually attain liberation, either in this life or in a future life. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, this is later in the gospel, he'll say, everybody will be fed. Some people at 6 in the morning, other people at noon, other people at 6 p.m., other people at midnight. But nobody will go without being fed. So that's his metaphor for saying that absolutely everybody will ultimately attain the highest spiritual goal of life. So if you combine all of these things, and I think all of them are important, if you combine all these things, then that's an important part of the answer to this question of why has God created so many evil tendencies which kind of make for all sorts of suffering in this world. So that's the saint-making theodicy, but that's not the end of his response to the problem of evil. There are two other components. In other places in the gospel, in one place, M tells Sri Ramakrishna that Vidyasagar, the great Pandit, the great Bengali Pandit, said in a mood of pique, Vidyasagar said, Genghis Khan had a bunch of like 100,000 prisoners. And he's stuck with these prisoners and he doesn't know what to do with them. And it'll be very expensive to keep them. And so Genghis Khan ordered his men to kill them. He says, because it'll be a waste of our money and resources to keep them living. And then Vidyasagar says, didn't God witness this? And couldn't God have prevented this from happening, this mass slaughter? So even if God exists, I want to have nothing to do with this God. And so M reports this to Sri Ramakrishna. And Sri Ramakrishna, in response, says, he appeals to what philosophers call skeptical theism. He says, Ishwarer karjo ki boja jay? Ki uddeshe ki koren? Can anyone understand the ways of God and for what reason he does or she does certain things rather than other things? It's not possible. It's a rhetorical question. That's the idea. So skeptical theism in philosophy of religion and theology is the view that why should we even think that our finite human intellects are capable of understanding the ways of an infinite God, of an infinite, omniscient, omnipotent God? That's skeptical theism. It's a fancy term, but it's a simple idea. And one analogy used by philosophers to explain it, William Alston uses this analogy. He says, imagine that I'm watching a chess match between, who's the best one in the world? Magnus Carlsen. And someone else at a very high level. And I'm an amateur. I know the rules of chess, but I'm not particularly good. And that's actually true of me. Okay. So now, I see Magnus Carlsen, number one in the world, make a move, like move the rook to a certain square. And I don't understand why he does that. Now, one thing I could conclude is, what an idiot. I wouldn't have done that. If I were Magnus Carlsen, I wouldn't have moved the rook there. Or maybe I should think, wait a minute, he's a whatever 2,000-something rated player, top chess player in the world, and I'm an idiot, as chess idiot. So maybe I'm not in a position to judge him. And Sri Ramakrishna is saying that the latter response is the more reasonable, or the latter attitude is the more reasonable one to take. Is that Magnus is thinking 50 moves in advance, and I can't even think 2 moves in advance. Do you see what I mean? So likewise, better for us to be humble and just to throw up our hands and say, look, I don't know why God does the things she does, but I've come to the mango orchard to eat mangoes, not to count the leaves. This is the idea. But he doesn't stop there, so notice that. So he starts by appealing to skeptical theism. Then he has this elaborate, what I call the saint-making theodicy, which he's elaborating here in the reading that we had for today. Okay?
And then there's a third component, because that's also not all. So the first component in his response to the problem of evil is skeptical theism. Can we really understand? How can we understand God's ways? Number two, a saint-making theodicy based on three key doctrines. The law of karma, the evolutionary law of karma. The law of karma, which is meant to foster our moral and spiritual growth. The doctrine of rebirth, and the doctrine of universal liberation. Because if there was a hell, an eternal hell, where even a single soul was condemned, then again you can raise the same problem of evil and say, why is God punishing somebody for his or her finite sins? At the end of the day, we make mistakes out of weakness and ignorance, right? But why would you condemn someone to an eternity in hell? So there's no hell, fortunately, in our tradition. Everybody will get liberated in the end. Okay, so these three doctrines comprise his saint-making theodicy. But the third component is the following. This comes later in the gospel. We'll eventually get to it, maybe, if I'm still here, who knows. Hari, the future Swami Turiyanandaji, is listening to Sri Ramakrishna, and Sri Ramakrishna is saying all these things, the similar kinds of things, that this whole world is mother's play, divine mother's play. And then Hari says something very poignant. He says, but her play is our death. God's play is our death. Very poignantly. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, immediately, but who are you? It is she alone who has become the 24 cosmic principles. This is the third prong in Sri Ramakrishna's response to the problem of evil, on my interpretation. What is he saying here? He's appealing to the spiritual state of Vijnana. He says the Vijnani is the one who realizes that Brahman has become everything in this world, that there's nothing but Divine Mother, playfully manifesting as everything and everyone in this world. So how is that a response to the problem of evil? Think about it. Hari is saying God's play is our death, and Sri Ramakrishna says, but who are you? Hari is presupposing a distinction between God and God's creatures. You see, there's God on the one hand who's playing and having a good time, having fun, and there's us, poor souls, who are dying and suffering. And Sri Ramakrishna says it's a false dichotomy. There's nothing but God, and even you are God, even though you don't know it. So the ultimate solution of the problem of evil is, I think, the spiritual standpoint of Vijnana. And I'm reminded of an incident in Sri Ramakrishna's life during his spiritual practice period when he sees a butterfly with a splinter in it. And he thinks to himself, what cruel boy must have inflicted this pain on this poor butterfly? And the next moment, he goes into a high state of spiritual ecstasy, which I take to be Vijnana. And he starts laughing uncontrollably. And he says, then I realize that it's Divine Mother playing in the form of the butterfly, the wounded butterfly, playing equally in the form of the boy who stuck the splinter in the butterfly, and playing in the form of the splinter itself. And then he says, what can I do but laugh when you realize that? So there are limits to kind of our rational, there are limits to what's called rational theodicy. That means trying to get God off the hook and try to justify God's ways in a rational way. Ultimately, we have to transcend reason. And the best answer to the problem of evil is a spiritual one where you actually get elevated to a state of mind where you realize that there's nothing but God. Okay? So this is a lot of heady stuff, and I want you to just let all that marinate. And any questions?
Yeah, so about prarabdha karma, so he who makes the law.
Oh, yeah, let's give him the mic.
Because he asked the question, anuragi, anuragi is very difficult to translate in one word in English. It is a kind of affectionate, loving, emotional attachment.
Yeah, right.
That is anurag.
Yeah. But not exactly the same thing as Vyakulata. That's what I'm saying. Exactly. So that's why I think it's significant that he's using two different words in the original, Anurag and Vyakulata.
That means it is pretty very conditional.
Right. Okay, good. So he agrees with me on that one. That's
Even
good.
Narada uses those two words, no? Like Narada starts with Parama Prema Rupa, something like Anurag, and then later he goes Parama Vyakulata Vismarane. Right, so in both but anyway, that's not my question. Is so prarabdha karma, Sri Ramakrishna often says he who writes the law can overturn it.
Yeah.
So let's say a person has some prarabdha karma.
Yeah.
Does Kapala mochana mean that prarabdha karma no longer needs to be paid if that person is saved by like an avatar or like Ma says through japa?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's quite that. I think as Holy Mother said, she said, if due to the law of karma, based on the law of karma, you're supposed to get the wound the size of a plowshare, by God's grace, that wound can be reduced to a kind of pinprick.
Literally?
Literally. Yeah. I mean, well, the idea is that it can, God's grace can mitigate the effects of karma, but not completely eliminate the effects. That's how I take it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah? Okay. Other questions?
Master has given another way.
What's the other one? Please give the mic to Sumana-sanji.
Oh, wait, you turned on.
The cow is there.
Whoa, okay. Huh.
The cow is there.
Yeah.
If the owner wants,
Yeah.
it's all right. Instead of extending the rope a little more for its grazing, it can make it completely free. Go and
Right.
the
You can pull out the post and put it somewhere else, actually, yeah.
That also, and it can make, and lust treatment can make us free also, because every whole grazing ground is his.
Cut off the rope as well, yeah.
So if it sees that you have already utilized the resources you are born with, then only God will give this. Otherwise, God sees that you have not grazed anything, you have not eaten anything.
Yeah.
So unnecessarily, why I will extend your robe so that you can have the approach of more areas, and you are not doing anything. And why I will make you completely free? Because you are unaware of your own resources.
Yeah. Thank you, Maharaj.
Scratch you can throw.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
Swamiji,
There are some online questions here.
there was an answer to your question that you asked somebody online to look up.
What's the answer? The Upanishad. Which
It's,
Upanishad is that?
It's the second to the third one. It's sort of a short paragraph. Second
I
to
see.
the third
he
last.
wrote it down. Second to
Yeah.
third from the last.
It's Rajit.
Kaushitaki Upanishad, 3.8. That's entirely possible. Yeshi eva sadhu. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you. Rojit Bishash. Very good. Kaushitaki Upanishad, 3.8. Thank you. Wonderful. All right. I'll read a couple online questions here. Let me see. One is from Ram Shin. Question to Maharaj. Recently, an astrologer told me I have 10% free will, but Sri Ramakrishna indicated I have no free will. Which one is true? That is a good question. Depends on whom you believe, the astrologer or Sri Ramakrishna. So, yeah. Well, right, but yeah. But this 10% is a very precise number. This, yeah. Okay, and then another question from NG. Question on Vijnana. Are devotees residing with the personal God always Vijnanis? Because Thakur says Gopi got Brahma Jnana even though they didn't want it, and they also saw Krishna everywhere, intoxicated with divine love. I don't understand the question exactly. Bhaktas don't have to be Vijnanis. There are also bhaktas who just worship Saguna Brahman, the personal God, but who have not realized Nirguna Brahman. And by definition, a Vijnani is somebody who has first realized their essence as non-dual pure consciousness, and then realizes the greater truth, the more comprehensive truth, that reality which is Nirguna, impersonal, is also Saguna, personal. So there are different kinds of bhaktas. The way that Swami Bhajanandaji, who's a vice president of our order in Beluma, the way he does it is he draws this parabola diagram. And he says, the lower trough on the left-hand side corresponds to the bhakta who worships the personal God, but who has not yet realized non-dual Brahman, impersonal Brahman. And then the peak of the parabola corresponds to what Sri Ramakrishna calls reaching the roof, which is knowledge of non-dual, impersonal, pure consciousness. And then the right-hand trough of the parabola is the Vijnani. The one who, after having attained knowledge of non-dual Brahman, comes back to this world as a bhakta and remains a bhakta, knowing that Shakti is inseparable from Brahman. So I hope that clarifies it. I see, okay. Okay, I think that's it. Any questions in person here? Any of you? Yeah.
Anyone besides Nishant before we go to Nishant again? No, I think, yeah.
Insofar as Shakti is describing as having Icha and that she's the only reality, is this a kind of Eka Jiva Vad where Shakti is the Eka Jiva?
Sure, I don't know if you would call her a jiva, that's the only thing. Yeah. But Eka Tattvavada or something.
But she isn't the substance, because Nikhilanji says the one substance, which also I think betrays classical Advaitic leanings, right?
Yeah, although the Bengali here is interesting.
Yeah, it's Padartha, which is not Dravya.
Yeah, but it does sound like substance in a way. I mean, that could easily be. So that's why I see Nikhilanji translating. But I know. That's why he says eternal substance. Yeah. So there, I don't think he's actually wrong in the translation.
But this tattva is self-aware, it has Icha.
Of course, yeah.
So it has all the properties of like a self-aware jiva. So Eka Tattva Vada, could I stretch that into an Eka Jiva Vada maybe?
Yeah, right. And in fact, even in Vedanta, the Appaya Dikshita talks about a school of Vedanta, which I think we don't even know what school it is, I think, but where there's one jiva, Eka Jiva, and that jiva is Ishvara. Is God. So in that sense, that's interesting. So, I think I don't see anything wrong with thinking of Sri Ramakrishna's this Vijnana Vedanta view as God alone exists. But at the same here's the way. But there's a complexity here, which is that he says that God actually manifests as so many, as all of us. Yeah, but in each of us has a different conscious perspective. I've done a lot of work on this, and I'm writing an article now on this issue too, which is that Divine Mother actually individuates into each of us. And each of us has different, none of us are realized, and so we have our weaknesses and stupid ideas and all these things, which God doesn't have, right? Because God is supposed to be perfect and omnipotent. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. So there has to be a kind of relative autonomy to these different individual souls. Even though all these souls are nothing but manifestations of Divine Mother, the way that Sri Aurobindo explains it, Sri Aurobindo says that, how is this possible? How do you reconcile these two things? The perfect infinite consciousness of the divine and our finite imperfect consciousnesses. And he says, Divine Mother herself, Satchitananda, Chit Shakti, becomes everyone through the dual process of what he calls self-limitation and exclusive concentration. This is in the Life Divine. Self-limitation. God, because God is omnipotent, God has the power to limit himself. And this is also very much like Sankocha, in Kashmir Shaivism. And then after limiting himself, after limiting himself or herself, God can then choose to kind of, at a superficial level, exclusively concentrate on one sort of egoic formation in such a way that each one of us is stuck in our own world because we haven't realized God. And we, turn our own problems into the world's biggest problems. And these are things that are not shared by God. Do you see what I mean? But we are still at the same time, at a deeper level, nothing but God. So anyway, that's a short answer to a very technical question. Any other questions? Yeah. Could you bring the mic over here? Thank you. Could you tell me your name first?
Albert. I really appreciate how you explained the difference between God being compassionate, where a parent isn't being compassionate just because they raised you. Right. Like you said, the analogy of the child asking for, I think it was money.
Patrimony,
Yeah, patrimony. I guess my question is generally if you ask, I don't know if I understood it right, but from what I heard was that if you ask God, for that, I think the previous statement was how do you escape this the karma, and then if you ask God to escape it, he will give it to you, right? But is that all is that the only thing you can exclusively ask for, is that what ultimately, that's the only thing that, is that all you can really ask for, or can you ask for more more material stuff while at the same time I guess, it's...
Okay, I'm not sure I understand your question, but if you're asking, can you pray for worldly things apart from spiritual things from God? Is that right?
In a sense, yeah.
So, yes, of course you can. And Gita says, for instance, there are 4 kinds of devotees
Sri Krishna says, 4 kinds of devotees worship me, and all of them are good. Arto jigyasu rathati jnani cha bharatarshava. And one of them is artharti, which are people who go to God for worldly things. Please heal my child. Please give me more money. This and that, 100 things. Please cure my cancer. These are worldly prayers. And he says, those are also good people. Why are they good? Because they believe in God at least. They go to God with their troubles, with their worldly desires, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, you can, but I still think that it's important to keep in mind that there's a kind of spiritual evolution, and that praying for spiritual things is a higher stage than praying for worldly things, even though both are good.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, in the back, right, Narayana, right there. Same row. Hi.
Hi. I guess, throughout the talk we mentioned that we all are capable of sin. We all have sin. And that is ultimately something that's given to us through God.
Yeah.
And in this sense, under my understanding, when we talk about Brahman, we're talking about all the different deities under Brahman. Is that kind of my understanding of Brahman, all different forms, versions of God?
Yeah, there's one God, but who manifests in
different forms.
Right.
Is there, I'm pretty new at this, is there a manifestation of within Brahman that covers sin? So is there a face and name?
That's what Sri Ramakrishna refers to as avidya maya, as the maya of ignorance. In another place, he doesn't define it here, but in other places he says, what is avidya maya? The maya of ignorance? Kama, krodha, lobha, lust, anger, greed, all these worldly, selfishness, egoism. But that's also God. So God is both vidya maya and avidya maya. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to be celebrating Kali Puja soon, and Kali, one of the things that's special about her is that her figure is ferocious and terrible, and she's got a garland of skulls, human skulls. And Swami Vivekananda wrote a poem about her, emphasizing that was the greatness of Kali, is that Hindus don't shrink away from the terrible aspect of God, because God can't just be the good and not the bad. God is everything, right? So that's, yeah.
Who dares dance destruction?
That's right, yeah.
Hug misery.
Yeah, it's a beautiful poem.
Who dares misery love and hug death and dance destruction dance? To him the mother comes.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. Anyone else? Questions? No? All right, good. Answered all your questions. It's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff that we have to cogitate over. No? You kind of look like you sort of have... Yeah, you do have a question. Okay, there you go.
Well, just to clarify, so if a person attains God and becomes a vijnani, they are still beholden to their karmas, but just their experience of that will be different.
Vijnana is complicated because Sri Ramakrishna used to say that only Ishvara Kotis generally can attain Vijnana. Of course, it's a little more complicated than that, but often he would say only Ishvara Kotis. Ishvara Kotis are defined as avatars and those born as parts of an avatara. Avatar ba avatara rangsho. And those Ishvara Kotis don't come here because of their own karma, because they're already perfected souls. They're nitya siddha. They're perfect already. They're ever perfect. And so that throws a wrench in this whole issue of. But so we have to restrict ourselves to ordinary souls, maybe. So do you want to reframe the question in terms of an ordinary soul who has realized God or something?
Well, I guess I'm misusing the term vijnani, but when he says God is trying to create saints, but then we create this other class of like super awesome special saints that don't need to be created because they were always perfect. Yeah. Doesn't that take the wind out of what he's trying to say here?
Oh, that's interesting. So yeah, there's saints and then there's super saints. Who are eternal saints. Like they don't need to go through the process of evolution and.
Like doesn't that doesn't make sense to me?
Yeah, but things are more complicated because, for instance, Brahmananda was one of the people that Sri Ramakrishna singled out as an Ishvara Koti. But didn't he evolve? Of course he did. He married. He had a kid. And Sri Ramakrishna says in one place in the Gospel, I send him back to his wife sometimes to have fun.
He's enjoying his pension.
Ektu bhog baki ache. He says he has a little enjoyment left. So even an Ishvara Koti can evolve, at least outwardly in the world, in a way.
And then he, of course, went on to become the first president of the Ramakrishna Mission, one of the greatest saints. And even look at Sri Ramakrishna's sadhana period. And of course, there's growth there, right? I mean, in a sense, at least, I mean, that's part of the play, of course. But there's clearly growth. There's a time when he was very fastidious about observing caste distinctions. And then at some point, he overcomes those things. Do you see what I mean? There are many examples of things like that.
And it's confusing to me that he got throat cancer too, right? Like that, it feels like when he's talking about karma and like the getting sick when you're about to die, it's just strange that there's all these separate rules that apply to like our favorite, like, God's people.
Yeah, but I think part of the beauty of the Avatara and what makes the Avatara so relatable is because even God, when God Panchabhute Phade Brahma Pore Kande. Yeah. So when Brahman himself is caught in the meshes of Maya, he cries, you see. So when God takes human form, even Sri Ramakrishna had to have throat cancer. This is God himself having throat cancer. One of the main reasons, there are different possibilities, but one of the main reasons we suggest is it's vicarious atonement. He's suffering cancer because of the sins that he took on, of people like Girish and others who committed many sins in the past. But in any case, the point is, even God, when God comes in human form, has to obey the same law of karma that all of us do. And that's part of the reason why God comes, in order for us to relate to him and for him to relate to us, do you see? And to actually go through what we're going through. When Keshav passed away, he was devastated. For days he was crying and, yeah, thank you. Yeah, okay, one last question from Nishant and then...
Outwardly, a super bhakta, not a like sectarian, bigoted one. Outwardly, a super bhakta and a Vijnani, will they look alike?
But what is a super bhakta?
Like just like a devotional, just someone who is like intoxicated with God.
Term?
No. Just like a bhakta, because I mean bhakta sometimes can be sectarian, right? But I mean like just like a bhakta who hasn't realized the non-dual
like
and personal.
A very devoted bhakta toward some form of the personal
God. Like who experiences the world like Moja Kuti, but just as a bhakti, has not experienced any in-person Brahman.
Right.
Outwardly, would they look alike?
These are very difficult hypothetical questions to answer. But one thing I would suggest, though, is one possible difference would be that super bhakta may still have at least a trace of fanaticism or one-sidedness because they only know God in that form and they'll mistake the whole of God for that part of God or that form of God whereas the Vijnani knows. Sri Ramakrishna as a Vijnani is worshipping God as Kali, but of course he knows that God is far more than just Kali in the form of the garland of skulls and God is equally Krishna, God is equally Christ, God is equally Brahman.
I see. That in the beginning, this devotion problem is that they become fanatic, they don't understand anything. But when parabhakti is generated, the supreme devotee is equal to supreme man of knowledge, wise one, Jnani. Their feeling becomes the same because the supreme bhakta devotee also says yatra yatra netra pare tatra tatra Krishna sura. Wherever he sees or she sees only the presence of God. Means ultimate. Krishna means it is not body Krishna, personal God. Krishna means this principle, ultimate reality. So in the Jnani also, Vijnani, the Vijnani, then Vijnani. Vijnani, then?
No. Vijnani is the highest. Jnani, then Vijnani.
Vijnani.
Yeah.
Vijnani also is seeing the same thing. Everywhere the presence of that. Supreme devotee also, they say that if you experience that supreme parabhakti, in the bhakti yoga it is there, your realization and your feeling will be all the same.
Yeah, so okay, we can, you have a question? Okay, one last question. I keep saying this last question. Go, yeah, please.
My apologies, Swami, I'll be brief.
No need to apologize.
Could you please explain one more time the role of God's Leela, God's play in my physical form? Like, is there a better way to understand? Like, you explained that you you explained that Sri Ramakrishna saw a butterfly that was torn up by a thorn.
Yeah.
So that metaphor, I'm having a hard time understanding it. In our human
it's not
life,
a metaphor. He actually saw a wounded butterfly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are we to understand ourselves as also the butterfly with the thorn, and that's having an experience of this?
Yeah.
Could you explain that one more time, please?
Well, it's not about explaining. It's about realizing. Yeah. And so that's why just appealing to Vijnana by itself is not an adequate theodicy. It's not an adequate explanation, because that leaves us in the cold, the people who don't have the benefit of the realization of Vijnana. You see, we're working toward Vijnana or some spiritual realization, but until we have that, we need a more rational explanation. But I bring up Vijnana as a third component of his three-pronged response to the problem of evil, precisely because first you need the rational explanation. So you need skeptical theism, which is, why should we even think that we can understand God's ways? Number two is the saint-making theodicy. That's the other second part of this, the rational answer to the problem of evil, which it combines the evolutionary doctrine of karma with rebirth and universal liberation. God has suffering in this world and evil in the world in order to create saints. That's the basic idea. That's what I call the saint-making theodicy. And then the third and final part is the Vijnana. From the spiritual standpoint of Vijnana, when you realize that everything and everyone is God, then the problem of evil is no longer a problem. The problem itself dissolves. The problem of evil is not so much solved as dissolved. That's the way I put it in my book. The standpoint of Vijnana does not solve the problem of evil, it dissolves the problem of evil, because the problem of evil presupposes a distinction between God and God's creatures, like Hari does in the gospel, later in the gospel. But God's play is our death. When you realize that there's nothing but God, then that means that you're God. That means that there's no problem of evil anymore. Because the problem of evil is the problem of an omnipotent God on the one hand, supposedly all perfectly loving and omnipotent God, causing us to suffer. But if we are God, then there's nothing but God. And God is just playing with his own manifestations or her own manifestations. Does that make sense? Okay.
Is there any way to maximize God's pleasure and happiness playing in our lives? Is that what the purpose is to become a saint?
To maximize, we don't have to worry so much about maximizing God's pleasure. God
Perhaps
is
not.
already infinitely, joyous and whatever. He's Ananda, Satchitananda. But we can. I was in last week's class. I gave a class on an essay, a beautiful essay called "What is Hindu Dharma?" And the last sentence is Swami Vivekananda encouraging us to recognize that we are playmates of Sri Ramakrishna and to enter the field of action accordingly. So we should think of ourselves as playmates of Divine Mother and to live our lives in accordance with that belief. Thank you. Om Niranjanam Nityamanantarupam Bhaktanukampadhrita Vigraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidhyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namami.